Hey guys, and welcome back to another day of Vlogmas. Today I wanted to share with you some books that are set during World War II. I know you're probably thinking that this is not Christmassy at all, and I guess you would be right because it's not really, but over the past couple of years I've just become increasingly fascinated with the period of time surrounding both world wars, the World War II in particular, and have started to read more and more from that time period. And because today happens to be the anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, I thought I would go ahead and share with you guys some books that I have read that have been set during and around World War II that I have really loved, and then show you guys some of the books on my own TBR that are also set during this period that I am really looking forward to jumping into. One last thing I want to mention before jumping into the actual books is that although these books are set during World War II, they aren't, I guess, your stereotypical war narrative, and that they don't really, they're not set on a battlefield, they don't follow soldiers or generals or politicians. I personally find that my favorite way to learn about the world wars and read about the world wars is to do so from perspectives that maybe we don't learn in school. So in school we tend to learn about military operations and political situations, but we don't necessarily get the everyday person's point of view. So I think you'll find that a lot of what I'm talking about here today comes at things from a slightly more inadvertent participant's point of view, if that makes sense. I'm going to start off with a novel, which is Julie Otsuka's The Buddha in the Attic. Now, I read this at the beginning of the year, and I do have a full-length review on this in case you want to hear me read some passages and get a better sense of whether this is something you would like to read. Now, this isn't strictly a World War II narrative, but actually follows a group of women known as Japanese picture brides who immigrate to the US. It's a really close-up, personal, first-person look at what it is like to be an immigrant in the United States. And while yes, things have definitely modernized a little, I think this is probably still a really accurate portrayal of what it feels like to move to a country where you don't speak the language, where you don't understand the culture, and where you're thought of as slightly less than. The reason I would recommend this as a World War II narrative is that obviously during World War II, Japanese Americans had kind of a shit deal, and the last 3 sections or chapters in this book really deal with what it was like being a Japanese American during World War II. It starts off examining just kind of shifting attitudes toward them as an entire group of people, and ends with internment and what that othering does to an entire group of people. And it's honestly a really fascinating read, and I think, again, in today's political climate, this is still so completely relevant. The other piece of fiction I would recommend is the novella Prize Stock by Kenzaburo Oye, who is a Japanese author. Now, I read it in this collection, Teach Us to Outgrow Our Madness, and I will link this and everything else I mentioned down in the description box below in case you guys are interested in anything that I mention. Prize Stock is set in kind of a backwoods Japanese village during World War II, and the main action that happens is that a Black American fighter pilot crash lands outside their village, and the villagers hold him captive. They plan on turning him over to the military as soon as possible, but in the meantime he gets basically placed under the care of this young boy because he's being kept in this boy's household. I should probably warn you that Prize Stock is a bit graphic, and it's definitely not an easy or comfortable read. It's actually, there were a few moments that actually kind of made my skin crawl, but I think it's a really fascinating look at how we look at humanity in times of war, and how war and violent climates really affect the children the most. And I think it's a fascinating story. It was gripping, it was kind of disturbing, and I would definitely recommend you guys check it out. Jumping into some nonfiction, I would definitely recommend you guys read Farewell to Manzanar by Jean Wakatsuki Houston and James D. Houston, which is a memoir of Jean and her family's time in the Japanese American internment camps. I read this one last year and was absolutely blown away by it because it is a very detailed first-person account of what it was like growing up in these internment camps, basically. And aside from giving a really detailed account of what life was like in the camps, Jean really touches on what life was like after the war, and even when they were released from the camps and allowed to go back to normal life, how that kind of stamp of suspicion doesn't rub off as easily as we would like to think. Another short nonfiction book I think we should all read is Hiroshima by John Hershey. Now, John Hershey was a journalist, and not only does this book report on kind of the immediate aftermath of dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, but he actually went back to Hiroshima 4 decades later and really wanted to capture and convey the lingering, lasting effects of atomic warfare. Obviously, this is graphic, and yes, it is very hard to read. I will not sugarcoat that, but I think it's so very important to read because, especially today where we've got superpowers kind of flexing their nuclear muscles, I think we tend to think of nuclear warfare a little bit too abstractly. We don't really understand the actual on-the-ground consequences of it, and I think although it is uncomfortable to read about, it's something that we should all be made aware of. The last nonfiction book I want to recommend to you guys, I don't actually have with me because my mom is currently reading it, and that is The Girls of Atomic City by Denise Kiernan. This tells the story of the various atomic cities that popped up around the US during World War II, where they were developing and testing nuclear technology, and it tells the story of not only the young women who finally were able to find some way of contributing to the war effort and who found a way of gaining independence through that, but it really kind of looks at, it's kind of like a microcosm of greater American society during the war, and I found that incredibly fascinating. I will say that I originally picked this up because I thought it was going to be more of like a feminist look at how women were super important to the war effort, and there is an element of that, but that isn't, I wouldn't summarize the book by calling it a feminist history of World War II. But like I said, these atomic towns really were like these little microcosms of greater American society. You see the same social issues, you see the same racial tension, and I mean, if anything, if you want to get a sense of what America was like during World War II, socially, on an everyday citizen level, this is the book for you. So those are some World War II related books that I have read already and would definitely recommend you guys check out. And now I just want to touch on a few books from my TBR that I'm also really looking forward to getting to. The first one I want to mention is called Star Sand, and it is written by Roger Pulvers. I probably should have looked at the summary again before I filmed this, but from what I remember, this is set in Japan, and it follows a young Japanese girl who finds 2 different pilots who've been shot down, and kind of ends up taking care of them. I believe one of the pilots is Japanese and one is American, so you get a little bit of tension there. Recently I picked up a separate piece by John Knowles at a library book sale, and when I put this in my haul video, you guys were so complimentary of this that I'm really looking forward to getting to it. This is set at a boys' boarding school in New England during the early years of World War II, and it is a harrowing and luminous parable of the dark side of adolescence. Jean is a lonely, introverted intellectual. Phineas is a handsome, taunting, daredevil athlete. What happens between the 2 friends one summer, like the war itself, banishes the innocence of these boys and their world. I of course had to throw Atonement on here because while I don't actually know a ton about the story, and I've tried to keep it that way on purpose, you know, no spoilers and all that, from what I understand, this is a really interesting look at how class played into military service in the UK during World War II. I've been dying to watch the film, and I keep telling myself that I'm not allowed to watch it until I've seen or until I've read the book, so hopefully I do that soon so I can finally watch the film and see the glorious James McAvoy. And the last book off my TBR that I feel like I really should have read by now but just haven't is Anne Frank, The Diary of a Young Girl. Obviously you guys all know what this is. This is probably the most famous World War II, I'm gonna go ahead and say book. I was gonna say memoir, but I think book. I think that's probably safe to say. This is my brother's old school copy because he had to read it for school, whereas I never did. And it's interesting because I feel like she's in the culture, you know. I feel like I know the story of Anne Frank even though I haven't read it, which I think is why I've allowed myself to put it off for so long. I think this will be really heartbreaking, really eye-opening, and one of these days I'm gonna put my big girl panties on and finally get to this one. So those are some recommendations I have for books set during World War II if you are also interested in this time period. And like I said, they're not battlefield books, they're not soldier books, so if you're not into like actual military history, but you still want to learn about what life was like during the war, these are some things I think you should check out. I actually thought I had read a lot more set during the war, and then while planning this video realized I hadn't, so definitely look out for another one of these videos in the future. And of course, if you guys have any recommendations, feel free to leave them down for me down in the comments below. I know you guys gave me a ton of really interesting World War I recommendations on a previous video, so leave me some World War II stuff down there. I want to give a huge shout out to my patrons like Mike Laird, who make videos like this possible, and I want to thank you guys for watching. I hope you're enjoying Vlogmas so far, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!